The morning of my wedding was a blur of satin and roses, a picturesque scene straight out of a bridal magazine. But as I stood in front of the mirror, clad in an elegant gown that hugged my frame, I felt like an actor playing a part in someone else's play. My name is Emily, a self-made entrepreneur with a passion for life's simple pleasures. Today, I was marrying Mark Harlington, a man whose world was as polished and refined as mine was straightforward and unadorned. Our story wasn't typical. We met by chance at a local cafe where I was nursing a latte and he was escaping the confines of his corporate life. He was charming, his Harvard education and successful banking career, a stark contrast to my own journey. I had built a modest but thriving business after high school, steering clear of the world of degrees and diplomas. The wedding venue was a grand affair, Mark's family sparing no expense. As I walked down the aisle, my heart raced, not with excitement, but with a creeping sense of dread. His family, a lineage of bankers and financiers, watched me with polite but distant smiles. Their world was one of legacy and tradition, and I was an outsider stepping into their sanctum. At the reception, the veneer of polite interest began to wear thin. I remember sitting at the head table, feeling like a specimen under a microscope. "So, Emily, tell us about your high school. That must have been quite an experience," Mark's mother, a regal woman with a hawkish gaze, inquired. Her tone was light, but the underlying condescension was palpable. I smiled, trying to keep my composure. It was a great learning environment. "I think it really prepared me well for running my own business," I replied, hoping my answer would suffice. "Oh, a businesswoman! How quaint," chimed in one of Mark's aunts, her eyes glinting with amusement. And here I thought Mark would marry someone from our alma mater. Mark, sitting beside me, gave a strained smile but said nothing. His silence was a void, growing larger and more oppressive with each passing moment. The evening wore on, a parade of toasts and congratulations, each one feeling more hollow than the last. I caught snippets of conversations, veiled references to my simpler background and unconventional path. I felt like an exhibit in their world, a curiosity to be examined and then dismissed. As the night drew to a close and the guests began to trickle out, Mark turned to me, his eyes searching mine. "You did great tonight, Emily. I know it's a lot to take in, but they'll warm up to you," he said, his voice a mix of reassurance and plea. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The truth was, I felt more alienated than ever. The Emily who entered that hall, hopeful and in love, felt like a distant memory. I was a stranger in this glittering world, a world where my worth was measured not by my achievements, but by the pedigree I lacked. As we left the venue, hand in hand, I looked up at the starry sky, wondering if my place was really alongside Mark in this new life, or if I had lost a part of myself in trying to fit into his. The wedding that was supposed to be mine felt like it belonged to everyone but me. After the wedding, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I had expected married life to be a blend of love and compromise, but I soon found myself in a world where my opinions seemed to matter less and less. Mark and I moved into the house I had bought with the earnings from my business, a cozy two-story home that was a testament to my hard work and independence. However, this sanctuary of mine was quickly invaded by the constant presence of Mark's mother, Mrs. Harlington. Mrs. Harlington, a matriarch with an air of aristocracy, began visiting us with alarming frequency. Each visit felt like an inspection, her hawkish eyes scanning every corner of my home, her lips often curled in a thinly veiled sneer. One evening, as Mark and I were finishing dinner, the doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Harlington, unannounced as usual. "Emily, darling, I hope I'm not intruding," she said, her voice smooth like silk, but with an underlying edge. "Not at all, Mrs. Harlington. Please, come in," I replied, forcing a smile. She swept into the living room, settling herself on the sofa with an air of ownership. "I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd check in on you two. This place does have a quaint charm," she remarked, her gaze flitting around the room. Mark joined us, greeting his mother warmly. "We're just enjoying some quiet time, Mom," he said, his tone casual. Mrs. Harlington turned her attention to me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Emily, dear, have you considered enrolling in some evening classes? Education is so important, you know." I felt a familiar sting at her words. "I'm quite content with what I've achieved so far, Mrs. Harlington. My business is doing well, and I'm happy with where I am," I responded, trying to keep my voice steady. She chafed softly, shaking her head. It's never too late to improve oneself, dear. Mark comes from a family of educated individuals. It's important to keep up, don't you think? Before I could reply, Mark intervened, his voice gentle yet firm. Mom, Emily's done really well for herself. Let's not dwell on this now. Mrs. Harlington smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course, dear. I only want what's best for both of you. The evening dragged on, with Mrs. Harlington's subtle jibes and Mark's attempts to deflect them. I felt like an outsider in my own home, my achievements and efforts dismissed with a wave of a hand. The visits became more frequent, each one chipping away at my sense of self. Mark, ever the peacemaker, tried to smooth things over, but his efforts felt hollow. The man who had promised to stand by me seemed more like a spectator, watching silently as the divide between his world and mine grew wider. One day, as I was tidying up after one of Mrs. Harlington's visits, Mark came up to me, his expression a mix of concern and helplessness. Emily, I know my mom can be a bit much, but she means well. She just wants us to be happy. I turned to him, frustration brimming in my voice. But what about what I want, Mark? What about my happiness? It feels like I'm losing a part of myself, trying to fit into this mold she's created for me. Mark reached out, his hand hesitating in the air before resting on my shoulder. We'll figure this out, Emily. We're in this together, remember? But as I looked into his eyes, I wasn't so sure anymore. We were together, yet worlds apart, caught in a web of expectations and pretenses. My home, once my pride and joy, had become a stage where I played a role scripted by someone else, and I was growing tired of performance. The Harlington family feast was an annual tradition, a grandiose gathering at their ancestral estate. This year, the invitation arrived addressed solely to Mark. Despite this, he insisted I accompany him, assuring me it was just an oversight. Reluctantly, I agreed, hoping that perhaps this time things would be different. As we drove up the winding driveway, lined with ancient oaks, the grandeur of the Harlington estate loomed before us. It was a symbol of their legacy, a testament to generations of wealth and influence. Stepping out of the car, I felt a knot in my stomach, a premonition of the evening ahead. The moment we entered, it was clear that my presence was neither expected nor welcomed. The air was thick with the scent of fine wine and gourmet cuisine, but it did nothing to ease the tension that gripped me. "Mark, darling, you're here!" exclaimed Mrs. Harlington, her voice echoing through the grand foyer. She approached us, her eyes flicking towards me with a frosty glint. "And Emily, surprised to see you!" Mark smiled, a hint of unease in his eyes. "Mom, you know Emily is part of the family now. I couldn't imagine coming without her." Mrs. Harlington's smile was tight, forced. "Of course, dear." As we mingled among the guests, the air of disapproval was palpable. Hushed whispers followed me, their words like barbs pricking at my confidence. Finally, we sat down to dinner, a lavish spread that could have graced the pages of any gourmet magazine. But the opulence of the setting did nothing to ease the discomfort of the company. I found myself seated at the far end of the table, isolated and conspicuous by my solitude. Mark was engaged in conversation with his relatives, his attention diverted. I tried to make small talk with the person next to me, but it was met with polite disinterest. Then, one of Mark's uncles, a portly man with a booming voice, turned to me. "So, Emily, Mark tells us you run a little shop. Must be a nice hobby to keep you busy," he said, his words dripping with condescension. I clenched my jaw, feeling a flush of anger. "It's actually a thriving business," I replied, my voice steady despite the rising turmoil within. "I've worked hard to build it from the ground up." There was a moment of awkward silence before he laughed, the sound grating and dismissive. "Well, we can't all be bankers, can we? Some of us have to do the simple tasks." The table erupted in laughter, a chorus of mockery that echoed in my ears. I looked to Mark, hoping for some semblance of support, but he was laughing along, his eyes avoiding mine. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any words. I excused myself, the walls of the dining room closing in on me. Outside, the cool night air was a balm to my frayed nerves. The laughter and chatter of the feast continued inside, a merry symphony to which I was the discordant note. As I stood alone under the starlit sky, the realization hit me like a physical blow. I was an outsider in this world, a misfit in their perfectly curated lives. My love for Mark, Once a beacon of hope, now felt like a chain binding me to a life where I didn't belong. The feast of fools, indeed, and I was the fool who had believed I could ever be one of them. The night of the feast left a bitter taste in my soul. I lay awake in our bed, the echoes of their laughter and Mark's betrayal haunting the silence. The moonlight streamed through the window, casting a pale glow on the walls of our bedroom, walls that felt like they were closing in on me. It was in this suffocating quiet that I had my awakening. I realized then that I had been living in a fog, trying to blend into a world that would never accept me. My love for Mark had blinded me to the fact that in his family's eyes, I would always be the uneducated outsider, the misfit. "Emily, are you awake?" Mark's voice broke the silence, tinged with concern. I turned to face him, his features soft in the moonlight. "Yes, I'm awake," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry about tonight," he said, reaching out to me. "They can be harsh, but they don't mean it. You know that, right?" I pulled away, a chasm of realization widening between us. Do I, Mark? Because tonight, it felt like they meant every word. And what hurt the most was seeing you laugh along with them. Mark sighed, running his hands through his hair. "Emily, I didn't know what to do. They're my family." "And what am I?" I asked, the words heavy with unspoken pain. He didn't answer, and in his silence I found mine. I sat up, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. "I've been trying so hard to fit into your world, Mark. But tonight, I realized that I don't belong there, and maybe I never will." Mark looked at me, his expression a mix of confusion and sadness. "What are you saying, Emily?" "I'm saying that I need to find where I belong, and it's not in a world where I'm constantly made to feel like I'm not enough. It's not with someone who can't stand up for me." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. I stood up, feeling a newfound strength coursing through me. For so long, I had let them define me, let them dictate my worth. But no more. I built a life for myself before you, Mark. I had a successful business, a home I was proud of. I did all that without a fancy degree or a family name. And I can do it again. Mark reached out, his voice tinged with desperation. "Emily, please, we can work through this. Don't let one bad night ruin what we have." I shook my head, a sad smile on my lips. "It's not just one bad night, Mark. It's every look, every word, every moment I felt less than in the eyes of your family, and every time you chose not to see it." I walked to the window, looking out at the night sky. It was vast and endless, filled with possibilities. I need to find my place in this world, Mark, and I need to do it on my own terms. As I stood there, a sense of clarity enveloped me. This was my awakening. The journey ahead would be mine alone, a path I would carve with the same determination that had brought me success before. I was not just Emily, Mark's wife. I was Emily, a woman of strength, resilience, and worth, and it was time for me to reclaim my story. In the days following my awakening, a plan began to take shape in my mind. It was born out of a need for closure, for asserting my worth in a world that had so casually dismissed it. I knew where to strike. The Harlington family's most prized asset, their bank. This wasn't just any bank. It was the pillar of their social standing, the source of their arrogance, and unbeknownst to them, the holder of my substantial fortune. I spent hours at my desk, poring over financial statements and investment portfolios. My business acumen, honed over years of navigating the markets, was my weapon. The Harlingtons, ensconced in their bubble of elitism, had no idea that the uneducated woman they mocked was a financial force in her own right. "Emily, you've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" Mark's voice broke my concentration one evening as he peered over my shoulder. I minimized the documents on my screen and turned to face him. "Just busy with work, Mark." "You know how it is," I replied, my voice steady. He nodded, though his eyes lingered on the computer screen, a flicker of curiosity in his gaze. "If you need help, I'm here, you know." I smiled, a tinge of sadness in my heart. "Thanks, Mark. I appreciate it." After he left, I returned to my plan. I initiated a series of discreet financial maneuvers, transferring my funds out of the Harlington Bank. Each transaction was a calculated step, draining the lifeblood of their financial empire. I watched as my billions flowed out, leaving a void that would soon become apparent. Within days, the news broke. The Harlington Bank was facing a liquidity crisis. I watched from a distance as the empire that had looked down upon me began to crumble. Mark came home that night, his face ashen. "Emily, have you seen the news? The bank, my family's bank, it's in trouble." I looked up from my laptop, feigning surprise. "That's terrible, Mark." He sank into a chair, his eyes haunted. "They're saying it's a major withdrawal. A significant client pulled out their funds. It's catastrophic." I leaned back, my heart racing with a mix of triumph and regret. That's the risk of the business world, isn't it? One day you're on top, the next you could be at the bottom. Mark's gaze met mine, a trace of suspicion in his eyes. "Yeah, that's the world we live in," he said slowly. As the days passed, the Harlington Bank's troubles deepened. The family was in disarray, their composure shattered. Mark was torn, caught between his family's crisis and the dawning realization that his wife was not the person he thought she was. One evening, as we sat in silence, he finally spoke. "Emily, is there something you're not telling me? About the bank? About everything?" I met his gaze, my decision made. "Mark, I've always been honest with you about who I am, but maybe it's time I showed you just how much you underestimated me." With that, I laid bare my plan, revealing the extent of my financial prowess and how I had single-handedly orchestrated the downfall of the Harlington Bank. The revelation hung between us, a testament to my resolve and his family's underestimation. Mark was speechless, his world turned upside down. I had emerged from the shadows, no longer the meek outsider, but a formidable player in the game they had so carelessly invited me to. This was my retribution, my statement to the world that I, Emily, was a force to be reckoned with. The plan wasn't just about revenge. It was a declaration of my independence, a reclaiming of my dignity in the face of those who had sought to diminish it. The revelation of my involvement in the Harlington Bank's downfall created a chasm in our marriage that could not be bridged. The once warm and loving home Mark and I shared now felt like a cold, distant battleground. The air was heavy with unsaid words and unexpressed emotions. Mark was a mixture of awe, confusion, and betrayal. He couldn't reconcile the woman he married with the mastermind who had brought his family's bank to its knees. One evening, as we sat at opposite ends of the dining table, the silence was deafening. Finally, Mark broke it. "Emily, why? Why did you do it?" His voice was a mix of anger and pain. I looked at him, my resolve firm. "You saw how your family treated me, Mark. You heard the things they said. Yet you never stood up for me. I was nothing to them, and you let me be treated that way. But to destroy the bank, my family's legacy. Was it worth it?" He was struggling to understand, to find reason in what seemed to him an incomprehensible act. "It was never about the bank, Mark. It was about respect, about being seen as an equal. Your family never saw me for who I am. They never gave me a chance." Mark's face was a mask of conflict. "But this is not you, Emily. I married a kind, loving woman, not someone who would seek revenge like this." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "Maybe you never really knew me, Mark. Maybe you only saw what you wanted to see." The decision to divorce was mutual but painful. The process was swift, facilitated by my financial independence and Mark's dawning realization that our paths had irrevocably diverged. As we sat in our lawyer's office, signing the papers that would dissolve our marriage, Mark looked up at me, his eyes searching for the woman he once knew. "Emily, I'm sorry. I wish things could have been different." I signed my name, the pen feeling heavy in my hand. "So do I, Mark. But we can't live on wishes. We have to face reality, and our reality is that we were never meant to be together." With the final signature, our marriage was officially over. I walked out of the lawyer's office feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. The chapter of my life with Mark was closed, and a new one was waiting to be written. The divorce granted me freedom and a significant portion of our shared assets, but it wasn't about the money. It was about reclaiming my self-worth and closing a painful chapter of my life. As I drove away from the lawyer's office, the city skyline stretched before me, a canvas of endless possibilities. I had entered my marriage as Emily, the unassuming entrepreneur, and emerged as a woman who had faced her battles and emerged stronger. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready for whatever challenges it might bring. I had learned that sometimes, to find your true strength, you have to face the darkest parts of yourself and emerge from the other side, transformed and renewed. The finalization of my divorce from Mark was not just the end of a marriage, but the birth of a new Emily. I found myself at a crossroads, with the path behind me littered with the debris of a broken relationship and a family's scorn, and the road ahead open and uncharted. In the quiet aftermath, I took to spending my evenings at a quaint little cafe downtown, the same place where Mark and I first met. It was here, over cups of steaming coffee, that I began to pen down my thoughts, reflections on my journey, and aspirations for the future. One such evening, as I was lost in my musings, the cafe owner, a kind middle-aged man named Joe, approached me. "You've been coming here a lot lately, always writing. If you don't mind me asking, what are you working on?" I looked up, smiling at his genuine curiosity. "Just some personal reflections, Joe. It's been a transformative period for me." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Life has a way of throwing us curveballs. It's how we catch them that matters. His words resonated with me, echoing my own thoughts. That's true. I've learned a lot about myself recently, about my strength, my resilience. Joe poured himself a coffee and sat down across from me. "Sounds like you've been through quite the journey. Care to share?" I hesitated for a moment, but then began to tell him about my marriage, the struggles with Mark's family, and how it all led to me finding my true self. Joe listened intently, nodding empathetically as I recounted my tale. "You know, Emily," he said after I finished, "you've got quite the story there. Ever thought about sharing it with the world? You never know who might find inspiration in it." His suggestion struck a chord in me. Perhaps my experiences could indeed help others facing similar struggles. Maybe I will, Joe. Maybe it's time my story found a voice. In the days that followed, I began to transform my notes into a memoir. Writing became a therapeutic process, a way to make sense of the chaos of the past months and to find closure. As I wrote, I also focused on rebuilding my business, applying the lessons I had learned from my ordeal. My company, once a small venture, began to grow, expanding its reach and scope. I was not just surviving, I was thriving. One afternoon, while I was reviewing some business contracts, my phone rang. It was Mark. I hadn't heard from him since the day we signed our divorce papers. "Emily, hi. I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his voice hesitant. "Hello, Mark. It's fine. What can I do for you?" I heard about your business. It's doing really well. I always knew you were capable, but I guess I never fully appreciated it." I paused, taking in his words. "Thank you, Mark. It's been a lot of hard work, but it's paying off." There was a moment of silence before he spoke again. "I'm sorry, Emily, for everything. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." I sighed, a sense of peace settling over me. "I've moved on, Mark. What happened between us? It's in the past. I've learned a lot from it, and I'm grateful for the lessons." "That's good to hear. I truly wish you all the best, Emily. You deserve it." As I hung up the phone, I realized that I had indeed come a long way. I was no longer the woman who sought approval or validation from others. I was Emily, a woman who had faced adversity and come out stronger, a woman who had found her voice and her place in the world. Sitting back, I looked around my office, a space that was distinctly mine, filled with symbols of my achievements and my dreams. I had a new beginning, a chance to write my own story, one where I was the protagonist, strong, independent, and free. Life in our little house nestled in the suburbs was like a scene from a quaint storybook. I, Emma, was the wife to a wonderful man named Jack and mother to our energetic son, Michael. Our world was small, but it was filled with immense love and laughter, making every moment a treasure. Jack was a man of simple joys. He loved gardening, and his laughter was infectious. He had a way of making even the dullest days seem bright. Michael, with his boundless energy and curiosity, was the apple of our eyes, always up to some mischief. Our days often began with the sweet aroma of pancakes, Jack's specialty. "Best way to start the day, Emma," he'd say, flipping a pancake perfectly in the air, much to Michael's delight. "Watch and learn, Michael. Your dad is the pancake king," I'd chime in, my heart swelling with pride and love. Michael would try to imitate his dad, his little hands clumsily working the spatula, his face a picture of concentration. "One day, I'll be just like Dad," he'd proclaim, and Jack would ruffle his hair, saying, "You'll be even better, champ." The garden was Jack's sanctuary, and he spent countless hours tending to it. The flowers seemed to bloom just to make him happy. On weekends, Michael and I would join him, each of us tending to our little patches. "A family that gardens together stays together," Jack would say with a wink. Our evenings were often spent in the living room, with Jack strumming his guitar, filling the house with melodies. I would often join in with my slightly off-key singing, and Michael would dance around, laughing and clapping and clapping. "Encore, Dad! Encore!" he would cheer, and Jack would oblige with another song. Holidays were especially magical. Christmas was a grand affair, with Jack dressing up as Santa, much to Michael's amusement. "Ho, ho! What does my little elf want for Christmas?" Jack would bellow in his best Santa impersonation. "I want 1,000,000 candies and a spaceship," Michael would shout, jumping into Jack's arms. "All right, Santa's workshop will have to work overtime," Jack would laugh, his eyes twinkling with the same excitement as our son's. Our life was simple, yet it was filled with moments that I wished could last forever. But life has a way of reminding us that nothing is permanent. Those days of joy and laughter, the sounds of music and mirth, the warmth of love and companionship, were the treasures I held close as we faced the tides of change. Little did I know that those cherished moments would soon become memories, etched in my heart as a reminder of a past filled with love and happiness. The vibrant colors of our life began to fade one winter. The days grew shorter, and so did our moments of joy. Jack, my beloved husband, was taken from us suddenly, leaving behind a void that seemed impossible to fill. The house, once filled with laughter and warmth, now echoed with the silence of our loss. The night Jack passed away, the world outside was covered in a blanket of snow, as if nature itself was mourning with us. I remember holding Michael close as we sat on the couch, lost in our grief. "Mom, is Dad really gone?" Michael's voice was small, trembling with the weight of his young world crumbling. I wrapped my arms around him, feeling the tears welling up in my eyes. "Yes, honey," I whispered, trying to stay strong for him. "But he will always be with us in our hearts and memories." "But I need him here, Mom! I miss him so much," Michael sobbed, his words muffled against my shoulder. I know, I murmured, my heart breaking for both of us. "We both do." The days that followed were a blur of condolences, sympathy, and the overwhelming reality of our loss. I tried to put on a brave face for Michael, but at night, when he was asleep, I'd allow myself to break down. The loneliness was suffocating, like a constant shadow that followed me around. One evening, as I was tucking Michael into bed, he looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes. "Mom, will Dad ever come back?" he asked, a hopeful note in his voice. I sat beside him, taking his hand in mine. "No, honey," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But he's watching over us, proud of his brave little boy." "I wish I could talk to him just one more time," Michael said, his voice quivering. "Me too, Michael. Me too," I replied, holding back my tears. In the wake of Jack's passing, I found solace in my work. I threw myself into my business, using it as an escape from the emptiness that filled our home. To my surprise, my dedication paid off. The business began to thrive, growing beyond what I had ever imagined, but the success felt hollow without Jack to share it with. "Mom, you're always working," Michael observed one day as I was buried in paperwork. "I know, honey," I replied, looking up from my desk. "It keeps me busy, helps me not to miss your dad so much." "Do you think Dad would be proud of you?" he asked, his eyes curious. "I hope so," I said, managing a small smile. "I'm doing this for us, for our future." But deep down, I knew that no amount of success or wealth could fill the void Jack had left in our hearts. I was a successful businesswoman, but at the end of the day, I was just a widow and a single mother trying to find her way in a world that had suddenly turned cold and unfamiliar. Time, as it inevitably does, moved forward, carrying us along with it. The sharp edges of our grief dulled, leaving behind a lingering ache. Michael grew into a fine young man, his father's image in many ways. His laughter, once a rare sound in the house, began to fill the rooms again. It was during this time of healing that Michael brought Sarah into our lives. I remember the day he introduced her. He had a sparkle in his eye, the kind that hadn't been there since his father's passing. "Mom, this is Sarah," he said, his voice tinged with excitement and nervousness. Sarah was strikingly beautiful, with a smile that seemed to light up the room. "It's so lovely to meet you, Mrs. Anderson," she said, her voice sweet and melodic. "Please, call me Emma," I replied, smiling back. "I've heard so much about you." As days turned into weeks, Sarah became a regular fixture in our home. Michael was clearly smitten, and I was happy to see him so in love. But as I got to know Sarah better, a nagging feeling began to take root in my heart. One afternoon, as I was preparing tea in the kitchen, I overheard a conversation between them that gave me pause. "Your mom seems nice, but a bit old-fashioned, don't you think?" Sarah's voice carried a hint of disdain. Michael hesitated before replying, "She's just from a different time, Sarah. She means well." The remark stung, but I brushed it off, attributing it to generational differences. However, as time passed, Sarah's true nature began to reveal itself. Her sweet facade would slip, revealing a more callous and mocking demeanor, especially towards me. One evening, while clearing the dinner table, Sarah's words cut through the air. "Honestly, Emma, it's like living with a pensioner. You really should try to keep up with the times." I felt a lump in my throat, but I forced a smile. "I guess I'm just set in my ways, Sarah." Michael, to my dismay, remained silent, his gaze fixed on his plate. It was then that I realized my son was blinded by love, unable or unwilling to see the disrespect aimed at me. As their relationship progressed, so did their plans for the future. The day Michael announced their engagement, my heart sank even as I mustered a congratulatory smile. "Mom, we're getting married!" Michael exclaimed, his eyes shining with happiness. "That's wonderful news, Michael," I replied, trying to sound enthusiastic. But deep down, I harbored reservations. I feared that Sarah's disdainful attitude and mocking remarks were red flags that Michael failed to see. Yet, out of love for my son, I kept my concerns to myself, hoping against hope that I was wrong about Sarah. In the privacy of my room, I often pondered the situation. "Jack, what would you do?" I'd whisper into the silence, longing for his guidance. But the answers never came, and I was left to navigate this new chapter on my own, filled with apprehension about what lay ahead. The engagement of Michael and Sarah marked the beginning of a challenging chapter in our lives. As their wedding plans unfolded, Sarah's true colors became increasingly evident, and the tension in our household grew. One evening, as we were discussing wedding arrangements, Sarah's sharp tongue made an unwelcome appearance. "Honestly, Emma, these ideas of yours are so dated. It's our wedding, not a trip down memory lane," she said, her words dripping with condescension. I tried to keep my composure, reminding myself that it was their special day. "Of course, Sarah, it's just a suggestion. It's important that you both have the wedding you want," I replied, forcing a smile. Michael, caught between us, offered a weak, "Mom's just trying to help Sarah." Her eyes rolled in response, a silent but clear dismissal of both my suggestions and my role in their lives. The more time I spent around Sarah, the more her disdain for me became apparent. Her comments, initially veiled and subtle, grew bolder and more hurtful. One afternoon, while Michael was out, Sarah visited. I thought it a good opportunity to bond, but instead, I found myself subjected to her cruelty. "You really are a pathetic pensioner, aren't you, Emma?" she sneered, examining the family photos on the mantel. "Stuck in your old ways, living in the past." I felt a pang of hurt, but my concern for Michael's happiness held my tongue. "Sarah, I don't think it's fair to—" "Fair?" she cut me off. "What's fair is that Michael finally has a chance to experience life without being smothered by his mother." Her words stung like a slap. I was taken aback, not just by the cruelty of her words, but by the realization that my son had chosen someone who could harbor such malice. I tried to voice my concerns to Michael. "Michael, I'm worried about how Sarah treats me. It's not just about differing opinions anymore. She's disrespectful," I said one evening, hoping he would understand. "Mom, you're overreacting." "Sarah is just stressed with the wedding." "It'll get better. You'll see," he replied, his tone dismissive. His unwillingness to see the truth deeply saddened me. I felt isolated in my own home, a place that once held so much joy and laughter. Despite my success in business, with my company now valued at over $300 million, Sarah's demeaning attitude made me feel small and insignificant. I never flaunted my wealth, believing in a humble lifestyle, but Sarah's ignorance of my financial status seemed to embolden her contempt towards me. As the wedding day approached, the atmosphere in our home grew heavier. I longed for the days when Jack was still with us, when happiness was not a rare visitor in our lives. One quiet evening, as I sat in Jack's old armchair, I whispered to his memory, "Jack, I'm lost. I don't know how to protect our son from this. I don't know how to make him see the truth." But the room remained silent, offering no answers, no comfort. I was alone in this struggle, trying to navigate the rising tensions and protect my son from a future that I feared would be filled with regret. The day of Michael and Sarah's wedding arrived with a mix of emotions swirling within me. Despite my reservations about Sarah, I wanted nothing more than for Michael to be happy. The wedding itself was a grand affair, reflecting more of Sarah's tastes than Michael's. As I watched the ceremony unfold, a part of me ached, missing Jack more than ever and wishing he could have been there to see our son getting married. During the reception, Sarah's behavior took a turn for the worse. She seemed to revel in belittling me, especially in front of her friends and family. "Look at Emma, trying so hard to fit in. It's almost cute how out of place she looks," she said loudly to a group of her friends, her voice dripping with mockery. I felt a flush of embarrassment, but I held my head high, refusing to let her see how her words affected me. Michael, busy entertaining guests, seemed oblivious to his wife's behavior. As the evening wore on, the comments continued. At one point, Sarah approached me with a glass of wine in her hand. "Here, Emma, drink up. It might make you feel younger," she sneered, her eyes cold. I accepted the glass, replying with as much grace as I could muster. "Thank you, Sarah. It's a lovely celebration." After the wedding, Michael and Sarah moved into Sarah's family home, a lavish estate that dwarfed our modest house. I visited them occasionally, hoping to maintain a relationship with my son, but each visit left me more disheartened. I began to notice a change in Michael. The light in his eyes dimmed, and he seemed constantly on edge, especially around Sarah. It was during one of these visits that I overheard an argument between them. "You need to do more, Michael! You can't just sit around and expect me to do everything!" Sarah yelled, her voice sharp and accusing. "Sarah, I'm trying. I've been working late every day this week," Michael replied, his voice wary. "Trying isn't good enough. You need to step up, or I'll find someone who will," she threatened, her words like daggers. Hearing this, my heart broke for Michael. He was trapped in a marriage with someone who didn't appreciate or respect him. I decided to confront him about it after Sarah had left the room. "Michael, you don't seem happy. This isn't the life you deserve," I said, my voice heavy with concern. "Mom, it's not as bad as it looks. We're just going through a rough patch," he replied, avoiding my gaze. "But she's hurting you emotionally, Michael. You need to consider your own well-being," I urged him, desperate for him to see the truth. "Mom, I can handle it. It's just how Sarah is. She doesn't mean it," he said, his voice laced with a resignation that pained me deeply. As I left their house that day, a sense of helplessness engulfed me. I could see the path my son was on, yet I felt powerless to change it. The joy and hope I once held for Michael's future were being eroded by the harsh reality of his present. The aftermath of the wedding was not a beginning of a new chapter for Michael and Sarah. It was the start of a troubling period that I feared would only worsen with time. The months following the wedding felt like a slow, painful descent. My visits to Michael and Sarah's home became a window into a world I wished my son wasn't a part of. Sarah's behavior towards both of us, especially me, grew increasingly hostile, while Michael seemed to wither under the constant barrage of her criticism. One fateful afternoon, I stopped by their house unannounced. The moment I stepped in, I could feel the tension. Michael looked tired, his eyes lacking the spark they once held. Sarah, on seeing me, didn't bother to hide her disdain. "What are you doing here, Emma?" Sarah's voice was cold, unwelcoming. "I just wanted to see how you both were doing," I replied, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. As we sat at the dinner table, the air was thick with unspoken words. Michael seemed nervous, constantly glancing at Sarah as if seeking approval. It was then that Sarah turned her venomous words towards me. "You really are a beggarly old retired woman, aren't you, Emma?" she sneered. "Why don't you just stay away from us? We don't need your pity visits." Michael, who I had hoped would stand up for me, remained silent, his head bowed. That silence was more painful than any of Sarah's words. It was a betrayal, a clear indication that he had chosen Sarah's side over mine. I stood up, my hands trembling, not with anger, but with a deep sense of hurt. "Michael, how can you let her speak to me like this?" I asked. my voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, it's complicated," he stammered, not meeting my eyes. "No, it's not complicated. It's about respect, something your wife clearly lacks," I said, my voice growing stronger with conviction. "Emma, just leave! You're not welcome here," Sarah interjected, her eyes gleaming with malice. I looked at Michael, waiting for him to say something, anything, but his silence spoke volumes. With a heavy heart, I walked out of their house, realizing that I had lost my son not just to Sarah, but to his own inability to stand up for what was right. That night, back at home, I made a decision. It was one of the hardest choices I had ever made, but it was necessary for my own well-being. I blocked their numbers and vowed to stop all financial support. I needed to distance myself from the toxicity that had engulfed Michael and Sarah's life. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I whispered into the darkness, "Jack, I tried. I tried to be there for our son, but I can't watch him destroy himself." The silence that followed was my only answer, a stark reminder of my solitude in this battle. Cutting ties with Michael was like losing a part of myself, but I knew it was the only way. The final straw had broken, not just my tolerance for Sarah's behavior, but the bond I thought was unbreakable between a mother and her son. The month following my decision to sever ties with Michael was a period of profound introspection and sorrow. The house, once filled with the sounds of a happy family, now echoed with the silence of my solitude. I would often find myself gazing at old photographs, reminiscing about the times when Jack was still with us and Michael was just a boy, full of innocence and joy. One evening, as I sat in a living room, lost in thought, the phone rang, breaking the silence. I glanced at the caller ID and saw Michael's number. For a moment, I hesitated, my heart racing. Reluctantly, I answered. "Mom, it's me." Michael's voice came through, sounding small and broken. "Michael," I replied, my voice steady but filled with a mix of emotions. "What's wrong?" "Everything, Mom. Sarah, she's leaving me. We've run out of money, and she says she can't be with someone who can't provide for her," he confessed, his voice cracking. I felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by a sense of vindication. "Michael, I warned you about her. You chose not to listen, not to protect me from her insults. And now, you're seeing her true colors," I said, my words laced with both concern and frustration. "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. I was blind, but I need your help now. Can you lend me some money?" he asked, his voice desperate. The request stung. After all the pain and betrayal, he was reaching out, not for reconciliation, but for financial help. "Michael, you need to stand on your own 2 feet. You chose this path. I can't bail you out every time you face a problem," I replied, my resolve firm. "But Mom, I have nowhere else to turn. I thought you would understand. I thought family meant something," he pleaded. "Family does mean something, Michael, but it also means respecting and supporting each other, which you failed to do," I answered, my heart heavy. "Please, Mom, I'm sorry. I really am," he said, the desperation in his voice palpable. "Michael, I love you, but I can't support this cycle of dependency and disrespect. It's time for you to learn from your mistakes and grow," I said, the finality in my voice marking the end of our conversation. As I hung up the phone, a myriad of emotions washed over me. There was relief for standing up for myself, there was sadness for the strained relationship with my son, and there was hope that this tough love would eventually lead Michael to a better path. That night, as I lay in bed, I spoke to Jack's memory again. "I did what I had to do, Jack, for our son's sake, for my own sake." The journey ahead was uncertain, and I knew that the road to healing and reconciliation would be long and arduous. But for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that I had taken a stand not just for my dignity, but also for the hope that one day, Michael would understand and appreciate the tough choices made out of love. This was the turning point, not just for me, but for the possibility of a new beginning, one where respect and love would once again be the